The Journal. The house was old, empty and silent. Gray light filtered in through long, unclean panes of glass, past filthy curtains, and fell on bare wooden floors and walls. Such scant furniture that remained was covered with filthy white cloths, looking like misshapen ghosts in the gloom. But that was all right. The glass could be cleaned, the curtains could be washed, the floors and walls could be polished. And as for the furnishings, well, he'd take a look at those later. They'd probably find a new home at Goodwill or the Salvation Army. Or, worst case, they could be thrown in the woods to quietly rot, and good riddance to them. He had his own furniture, and plenty of it. The house's anecdotal history had been an interesting one. Supposedly it was over 2 centuries old, at least part of it, though the most recent additions had been made less than 50 years ago. It had been attached to a farm for most of its history, though now the fields were overgrown with weeds and the woods had closed in and strangled the paths with brambles and young saplings. None of that was out of the ordinary, of course. There were still plenty of old farmhouses that had been added onto, on land that was no longer farmed. Even the cemeteries were nothing out of the ordinary. It was common for old family farms to have family cemeteries, at least if the families had been well off. What was unusual was what had happened to the previous owners, or may have happened since they seemed to have simply disappeared. Of course, he suspected there may have been some financial debts involved. No one simply disappeared. But who knew? They hadn't taken their furniture at least, and that was why he so strongly doubted that any of those shrouded forms would be worth keeping. If they were, they'd have been taken or sold off months ago. His own furniture would be arriving the following morning, and he hadn't yet planned where it would all go. This room in particular, with only about 3 feet of vertical space before the walls sloped to follow the angle of the roof, would be particularly troublesome. With the 2 doors, windows that had to be kept clear, and permanent shelving on or recessed into the walls. Unlike other rooms, the shelving's placement was peculiar, as if it had been fitted into or onto the walls to take advantage or work around existing furniture rather than the other way around. Eventually, he'd probably have to redo the walls and take the recessed shelving out completely. The horrible old wallpaper could be replaced at the same time, in fact. But in the meantime, his furniture would have to go somewhere. He'd had to look around this room before, of course. He looked around every room. But there was something peculiar about this one, about the largest of the recessed shelves, in fact. There was no way to tell what had once been stored there, but whatever it was would have been rather inconvenienced by the unsightly nails that had been driven through the sides. That in itself would have merely been unsightly, except that the only way they could have ended up there is if the sides of the shelves had been nailed from behind the wall. Sometimes crazy things like that happened in old houses that were sufficiently elderly to predate building codes. But in order for that to happen, the shelving would have had to have been installed at the same time, or possibly even before the wall itself. This seemed unlikely. It was a small mystery, a little thing, but those dull, tarnished protruding points filled him with a faint thrill of the unknown. It was probably nothing, almost certainly nothing. What if it wasn't? This was something he wanted to investigate before the furniture arrived, and since he hadn't had the electric service reconnected yet, well, there was still light. Between hammering the nails in and prying on the frame, he was able to work the entire shelf out of the wall. His efforts left the sheetrock mangled and the trim splintered and broken, but the twin nails had been all that was holding it in, and the heavy wood nearly crushed his foot when it caught him off guard, but in the end his efforts were rewarded, and a hole in the wall opened into the crawl space beyond. He had expected dust and spiderwebs and old fiberglass insulation. There would be wiring, perhaps pipes for the heating system, maybe some loose boards and construction debris. Maybe, if he were really lucky, there would be something the vanished family had stashed back there. A box of dusty bills or maybe even gold or silver. It was too much to expect, of course, but he couldn't help himself. What he hadn't expected was the carpet. The space behind the wall was dark and full of shadows, and the weak, dirty light didn't help much, but it looked very much like someone had turned the crawl space into a secret room. The roof was covered with what looked like cardboard instead of sheetrock, and the far wall was some kind of window screen. But he'd been right. There was a secret here, and as far as he could tell, one that everyone before him had missed. It took him 5 minutes to dig a flashlight out of his car, but only a moment's hesitation to plunge headfirst through the opening in the wall onto the dusty carpet beyond. As he swung the bright white beam around in the dark, his surprise only grew. There were shelves here too, but these were full. To his left, against the wall, were shelves that held a curious combination of board games and construction tools, drills and saws and staplers, and boxes of screws and nails. There were other shelves along the inside of the wall, and these were full of books and movies. The books look old to ancient, but some of the movies were new enough that they'd been released in the past couple of years. Very few were still in plastic. The room, which was simply a space that had been screened off from the rest of the crawl space and carpeted, continued perhaps 15 feet before ending in a screen wall with a little door, barely big enough to crawl through. An electric drill with a frayed cord lay in the middle of the carpet like a dog's abandoned chew toy. As a discovery, it was interesting and certainly a surprise. But there was nothing here of any particular value, not unless that Monopoly box was stuffed with real money. He doubted it was, but checked anyway. The air here felt dead, quiet and stale, though that was hardly unusual. Even empty, the rest of the house had been dusty and silent, but the atmosphere here in this secret space was especially oppressive and even a little unsettling. It was only after completely examining the carpeted screened-off area, and even after that he hesitated before gingerly pulling the hatch open and shining the light further into the house's hidden sunless recesses. Nowhere here was there nearly enough room to stand, and he had to crawl along the narrow walkway that continued beyond the wall. This was wood, rough and unsanded, and though it was screened off, no carpet had been wasted here. Shining the light through the screen downward, he was able to see what he had expected in the first place. The bones of the house, rafters and insulation, armored cable and wiring snaking everywhere, and smaller wire that might have been for long since vanished speakers. In the middle of the corridor was a sort of door, but he saw no need to crawl out onto the little platform beyond and investigate. He could see everything he needed to here. There were piles of styrofoam and cardboard, a few dusty old boards, and lots of dusty cobwebs. The little screened-off crawlway ended in another door, and he paused, holding his breath before pushing it open. He half expected another carpeted room, or maybe here was where the valuables, the hidden money had been stored. Or maybe some other treasure, or who knew? But there was none of that. Work had started here. There was a floor of rough boards, but they'd been neither nailed nor screwed down, and the guts of a pair of electrical boxes had been laid out as if they were just about to be installed, but none of that had happened. Wiring lay in a coil, but there was nothing else except a dusty composition book, which in his disappointment he almost overlooked. Squatting down on the dusty boards, he opened the journal, and by the light of his flashlight he read. The journal was a diary of sorts. The entries a combination of code and plain, if mind-numbingly boring text. Reading a line here, a date there, he flipped randomly through the line pages until something caught his eye. Then he read the text again before flipping back to the previous page where the entry started. 13 May. Another one of the dogs disappeared today. Actually, it was probably sometime during the night, which would make sense if it was the coyotes again. We haven't actually seen any coyotes in a couple months, but there are always coyotes around. I'm worried about the cats, but most of them sleep inside now, or at least on the back porch. Jinx won't come in, but at least she stays close to the house, and the coyotes have always kept their distance. Still, cats will be cats, and so I worry. The walkway behind the wall is mostly finished. As soon as it's finished, I'll work on adding another door in the far wall. I like the idea of a secret hiding spot that can only be accessed by removing a bookshelf from the wall, but it's just too inconvenient to have to take off all the books and movies and CDs, and then have to put them back after I'm done. And they take up so much space I can't lay on my bed until I do put them all back. I'll have to wait until my parents are away since this project is a secret, after all, but it's not terribly urgent. In the meantime, I have other things to deal with. In a bit I'll take a rifle and go down into the woods along the highway and see if I can find any sign of those coyotes. I won't get a shot at one, they're much too clever for that, but I may be able to find some trace of them or maybe even scare them off for a couple days. I suppose we could just set traps, but I'm against that. It may be the most effective option, but it's a damn awful and slow way to die. I don't want my cats to die. But I also don't want that on my conscience. If it's the choice between the two, though. 13 May. The year wasn't mentioned, but it was towards the end of the written pages, and it described a specific point in the crude construction that had been done behind the walls here. Obviously, something had happened to prevent it from being finished. He checked his watch, flipped a few pages, and started to read again. 25 June. I saw it. The thing that killed the cats and dogs and probably the coyotes too if they didn't all run off. I dare not tell my parents, there's no way they'd believe me. It's impossible, I don't believe it myself, but I still saw it. It had been too hot to get to sleep, so I went downstairs to get something to drink. There was nothing unusual, nothing out of the ordinary, but the house felt unnaturally still and quiet. One of the cats, my mother's, was cowering in the folding chair, kind of like, I don't know. His ears were pinned back and he was all fluffed up, but he wasn't acting like a scared cat usually does. It was strange. Well, whatever. I walked into the living room, got some Coke out of the refrigerator right next to the door that's mostly glass, turned the light off and walked back through the living room. The cat was still there, still all fluffed out and still had his ears pinned back again. But this time he was growling softly and I looked across the room and out the window. It was a skull, like a horse's but smaller, more tapered. At first I thought it was a joke, maybe something my parents had staked outside the window, but then I saw the hair, the patches of skin, the empty eye sockets. And it moved, not in an artificial way, but in an organic way that was all too natural. I swear it turned, the skull angled itself to look at me. I was so scared I couldn't move and just stood there frozen, feeling the cold glass in my hand, and with Giuseppe the cat growling quietly. From the other room the clock ticked and the smoke alarm in the ceiling chirped as it does. I heard all these things, but I couldn't look away. The jaws parted slightly, revealing fangs. I was sure it was going to turn and leap through the window, but it didn't. Instead, barely seeming to move, it backed away from the window and disappeared into the night. In the light of day writing this, I have to wonder if I was really awake, or I just dreamed it. It certainly wasn't a horse, I know that. The fangs? Maybe. But no, it couldn't have been some kind of dog either, not even one that had been through a horrible accident. It was straight out of a zombie movie, and surely nothing could live with half its skull exposed and its eye a gaping cavity, and no one would believe me anyway. I must have been dreaming. That was the only way I was able to close my eyes that night, upstairs with all my lights on, curtains drawn, and a knife under my pillow, for all the good that would do against something that couldn't possibly be living. That's what I told myself over and over again. But in the morning, the cup I'd gotten downstairs was sitting by my bed, and Giuseppe the cat was gone. My parents, my mom anyway, my dad hates cats, were upset but wouldn't believe me when I told them he'd been inside all night. He must have been outside, the coyotes must have gotten him. But I know he was inside, and the doors had been locked and the windows shut. He looked up from the messy scrawl, looking around the cramped, dusty space between the walls. The darkness seemed darker, the bones of the house tighter and more oppressive than the dust. Well, the dust was still everywhere, no change there. It must have been some kind of story, maybe even something left behind as a joke. But who would leave it back here of all places? It was an awful lot of effort to go through, and he couldn't for the life of him imagine how it could have been left there by accident. It was difficult reading, not because the words were complicated, but because the writing was so messy, as if the writer had scrawled it in a hurry. A rough draft of a story, maybe? He checked his watch. There were other things he had to do, but he flipped some more pages. Most of the journal was empty, page after blank page, and he quickly flipped back until he found pages with the writer's chicken scratch text. This entry was in dark, strong ink, probably from a gel pen, different from the blue ballpoint the earlier entry had been written in. July 1st. The last of the cats is gone, and he disappeared from my room, in my bed right next to me. Chester was my only unconditional friend, and I would be heartbroken were I not so terrified. Were I not so frightened, I would hope that I'd be next. By now my parents realize that it isn't the coyotes, but they still go to bed and still get up and go about their days if nothing is happening. I beg to leave, but where to? We should stay in a motel, but my dad won't let the money be spent. It's a waste, he won't have it. We could at least go somewhere, stay out all night, sleep in the car if we have to. But none of that. That's silly. And now Chester's dead. I'll never forgive them. But I should have taken the car anyway, license or not, but I was too afraid of that too. If the police caught me, I'd be locked up and they'd take Chester, or he'd get out of the car and run away and I'd never see him again. At least that way he might still be alive. I hate them. I hate me. It was my fault. The house is quiet now. Outside is quiet. There are no birds, no dogs barking in the distance, not even insects. Just the wind and the distant sounds of the interstate. I think they're scared too, but if so, why won't they do something? All the dogs, all the cats disappeared without a sound. The thing I saw that night must have gotten them, must have got inside somehow. Through doors, through walls? What if I'm next? I don't know. Maybe if I tell them what I've saw. They've gone to bed now and I'm afraid to open my door and go out into the hall. The people had disappeared, the real estate agent told them. They left everything behind. Against his will, a cold chill ran down his spine. It was silly, he knew, but perhaps it was some remnant of the excitement he'd felt upon finding this secret space. But he was curious. There weren't too many more entries judging from the pages that had writing on them, but maybe here wasn't the best spot to finish reading. He took the little journal along with the flashlight and crawled his way back to the hole in the wall and out into the light. How much brighter it seemed after the dark, dusty space behind the walls. And how dark the hole itself looked. Almost like an empty socket in a scut. No, he was letting the story get to him. Best to finish reading it and move on. He moved over to the window, scrubbing some of the grime off with the cuff of his sleeve, and flipped the journal open again. There was a day missing, and the next entry was labeled July 3rd. I saw it again. I decided to go talk to my parents after all, night or not. I opened the door to the hall, stepped out and onto the stairs, and it was there at the bottom. Before I'd only seen the side of its head, its skull, but now I don't know what I saw. There was a skull partially covered with dark hairy skin and a body that was as much bone and rags as skin, as if it were wearing old rotten clothes or rags. But they were so dark it was hard to tell where the rags began and the skin ended, but through the dark mass poked shards of pale bone. The light in the hall was off, and there was just salt lamp nightlight, but all that did was dye the bony bits the color of blood and fire. It was perfectly still, perfectly quiet, just standing on all four limbs and staring. And the legs, half bone, half hairy flesh, as if the thing were rotting while still alive. It should have stunk, I think, like rotting meat or like rot, but there was no smell at all. I froze this time too, but only for a moment that seemed like forever, and I flung myself back into my room, threw the door closed behind me and locked it, and then I screamed. I don't even remember what, for my parents to wake up, to help, to run, whether I was trying to drive the thing away with the noise or whether I was just too terrified to do anything else. I remember expecting to hear its bony hooves clip-clopping slowly up the steps, but it was too late for me to hide and I couldn't have forced myself to stop screaming if I tried. I think I did try. I wanted to, but I couldn't. But I never heard any sound from downstairs. Maybe not over my own noise, or maybe there was nothing to hear. I don't even remember whether I screamed myself hoarse or I was able to force myself into terrified silence. I do know I never bothered to pile anything heavy in front of the door, since the lock was a joke and even locked the old door could usually simply be pushed open. But for whatever reason it passed me by. I waited all night, nothing but the beating of my heart and the sound of rushing blood in my ears. I was terrified that if I closed my eyes it would be standing in front of me when I opened them, and maybe it would have been, I don't know, but it passed me by. It wasn't until it was full light outside, and a single bird sang in the distance, that I could make myself wrench the door open and force myself out into the hall. The house was empty. The kitchen was cold and empty, the sink full of dishes from the night before, the doors all locked and the car still here, and the bed was empty and unmade. They were just gone. Maybe they went somewhere, maybe rode with someone and didn't want to bother me. Never mind I hadn't seen or heard a car, never mind that there was none of the morning arguing that always filtered up through the floorboards, never mind any of that. It must have all been a dream, I told myself. I didn't think I fell asleep, but maybe somewhere I'd moved from waking to dream to back without realizing it. I tell myself this and I wait. They'll be home soon and I'll talk to them then, and then we'll leave and go somewhere. Anywhere. I just have to wait for them to get back. He paged through the journal again. There was only one more entry, only a page and a bit, and the handwriting was so sloppy it was almost as if it had been written by someone else. It was a nervous, anxious script, as if the writer had been writing as fast as possible without looking at the page as he or she did so. It was unsettling just to look at, and took far longer to decipher than any of the previous pages. As he read, he felt his own anxiety steadily grow. The final date in the chicken scratch hand was July 3rd, presumably later that day. They didn't come home and now it's too late. It's getting dark, it's darker inside and outside and I can't go out. They aren't coming back, it got them too like it did everyone else. My cats, the dogs, everything, even the bird from his cage. I'm next, I can feel it. It'll come for me soon. It's too late to run. Already I can feel it near. It's too quiet, too still. I'm alone, but I feel like I'm being watched. I had to hide. There's only one place without doors or windows, only one place nobody knows about. Not even my parents know. I hid here behind the wall. I always had to work on it when they weren't here, and now I never finished. I had to work slow, too many spiders, snakes, even bees. But if nobody knows, maybe it won't know either. And I sealed myself in. I still had the drill and the screws, and I pulled the shelves in behind me and screwed them in. I wish I had thought to bring the shotgun, but I didn't think. And now there's no time. But it only comes at night. Only at night, only in the dark. In the morning I'll run away. I'll take a car and drive as far as I can. Or I'll call the police, have them lock me up. Or I'll make a suicide threat and pretend to be a nut job and they'll have to lock me up. If I pretend I can stay, can I stay forever? Will I be safe? My poor cats. At this point there was a break in the wall of text, and when it resumed it was even worse, the letters misshapen and the words barely recognizable. It was only with an effort, fighting for the identity of each word and sometimes having to move on and come back when he had an idea of what would make contextual sense that he was able to tentatively identify it. But slowly, the last of that final entry unfolded its terrible message. There was no punctuation, no spacing, only the garbled words themselves. It's here, I don't know how it got in, I just looked away and there it was on the other side of the screen. There was no sound, it must have come through the wall. The light's on, I can see it staring at me, no eyes, empty skull looking at me, I can't look away, can't. The tortured text finally gave out, in the middle of a jumble of jagged lines and curves that might have been part of a word. He flipped through the journal's pages once more in hopes of finding something overlooked sandwiched in between the blank but slightly yellowing pages. But there was nothing. Turning away from the grimy window, he looked back at the dark hole surrounded by a jagged outline of sheetrock where he'd pried it out of the wall. The screws had been put in from behind the wall just as the journal had claimed. He thought they were nails, but, well, that was probably why it had given him so much trouble. He tried not to think about it, but it was all too easy to imagine himself as a boy or girl. How old? The journal hadn't hinted. Too young to drive? Or just no license? He imagined himself huddled behind the wall, in the far corner, as far back as he could go and writing those last frenzied and deformed characters, not looking at the page at all, but at a terrible creature of bone and rag and decayed flesh and matted fur from which he dare not look away until he did? He felt a chill and the room seemed darker. This time, though, it was no psychological illusion, but the sun creeping lower towards the horizon as the day waned. It was evening, and night was inexorably approaching. Surely the truck with the furniture would be here shortly. He just had to wait a little longer. In the morning he'd look into it, see what he could find out. Maybe some of the neighbors could tell him about the story in the journal, about the people who might have wrote it and left it behind for him to find. But not now. He had his furniture to wait for. And besides, it would be dark soon.